Hello and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope no matter what it is you're doing today, you have a beautiful day doing it. For today's free wirework tutorial here on YouTube, I'd like to share with you one of my earliest ever designs that I taught on TV, which is a really super simple and very fast to make cabochon in wire. Super easy setting for you. If you'd like to join me down at the board, I will show you that a little bit more closely before we move on to the materials that we'll need. So here is an absolutely beautiful faceted cabochon of labradorite, so faceted top, flat back, and it's a very simple make indeed. There's no complicated weaving, there's no technically hard aspects to manage. In fact, there's very little in the way of weaving at all. What we have to work with today is a 1mm or 18 gauge wire, which provides the framework and the bail. And then on top of that we have some 20 gauge, which is equivalent to 0.8mm gauge wire, and that provides the security housing to keep the cabochon in place, and this small bit of extra detail on the neckline. To create this piece today, I've got one of my stunt cabochons from my massive collection of cabs. It's a huge piece. So when I'm talking about wire lengths today, the wire length I'll be stating is for an absolutely huge, massive piece like this. So you can size the wire lengths down for smaller pieces. There's always uses for offcuts of wire. Never throw them away unless they're really, really teeny tiny. So I'm going to pop this piece up in the corner for now, and we'll get cracking on our fastest ever cabochon set. So I'm going to begin with around about 14 to 15 inches of 1mm or 18 gauge wire, and I'm just going to make sure that that's nice and smooth and warm so that it's ready to work and there's no massive kinks in it. There's some kinks here at the end, but we'll probably get rid of that later. What I'm worried about for right now is to make sure that this central section is lovely and smooth. So I'm going to press the cabochon down into my board. Now my board is a hard paper and it's got no detritus on the surface, so there's nothing to scratch my cab. You can use a beading board or a bead mat, whichever you prefer. I actually find that the macrame boards are quite nice because you've got a little bit of give to them as well. So what I want to do is to create a basic shape starting in the centre of my long length of that 18 gauge wire. I'm going to draw the wire all the way around to get a basic shape. Now I'm going to set my cabochon in landscape mode today. Doesn't matter where you set it, you can even set them on the wonk if you like. It's up to you. When you're making jewellery, that's the absolute joy of the process. You get to choose how that looks exactly just for you, which is wonderful. One of the reasons I started making jewellery was to take more control over the aesthetics. Very early on in my jewellery making career, I simply bought junk jewellery, fashion jewellery, cut it all up and then mashed it together to make a piece that nobody else had. So I've got a basic framework to begin with, and what I want to do is just either side of the 12 o'clock position. If we imagine my cab is a clock face, we've got 12, 3, 6 and 9. So we're going to be looking at the 12 o'clock position, and I want to create two uprights with the wire that we have just crossing over at the top. So what I'm going to do is take a bit of a stab in the dark and assume that that's approximately central. And we don't want it to be too far apart. We don't want any massive, great big gaps in there. So to make my life easier, I'm going to spin that round to the side for a moment. And I'm just going to see if I can get my wire to sit a little bit more closely. If I was actually going to work with this as a cabochon, I would probably gauge that wire up to become 1.25mm or 16 gauge. But as I'm just going to use this cab over and over again to teach designs, I'm working with 1mm or 18 gauge. So what I want to do is to reflect the uprights on both sides, take the cab out of position for a moment. I do need to get these two nice and sharp, so I have the opportunity now just to moderate those around a little bit and get a nice sharp upward bend on them. I'm not overly worried about the fact that one is much longer than the other. Doesn't really matter, we've got plenty of wire to work with. So once I'm happy that those bends are nice and sharp, and I'm going to grip that on the part that goes around the cab and just draw that up before carefully bringing that back down. The next thing that I'm going to do is try and bring those two to become a little bit more tramline-like. So I want them to sit side by side at that 12 o'clock position. Pop the cab back in and make sure that it fits nicely. Now we don't want that to be too tight around the cab. A little bit of airspace around the outside of the cab and the inside of that frame is ideal. If you find that you've made this just a little bit too small, I'll show you now how you can just enlarge that ever so slightly. Now just pop the pliers in close to the end where you've created that bend. Very, very gently open that out slightly. Move the pliers along and re-bend a couple of millimeters further up if that's something you need to do. If you warm your wire before we start working, then that is entirely possible. So pop the cab back in. That's given us just a little bit more space. So I've set that size. If you wanted to, you could take this to a block and hammer that basic shape. Because we're working with such a vast cab, that probably wouldn't be a bad idea. I don't have my block with me today, so I'm not going to do that, but you certainly could hammer, and really not much further up, because we will be doing more with these straight sections later. Take the cab back out and ignore that for the time being. The next thing that we want to do is bring in our second strand of wire. Now this is 0.8mm gauge, it's all round wire, very easy to come by, and I'm working with raw copper because I like how it works. Here I have around about 18 inches, and that's just because the cabochon is so huge. For a cab of this size, which is a fairly average sized cab to work with for pendants, you would definitely need or be able to size that down significantly. So what I'm going to do is find the centre of my lighter gauge wire, my 0.8mm, and I'm just going to warm that central section through nicely and just create a little bit of a curve, and that's in the dead centre of my lighter gauge wire. I'm going to get a nice gentle curve over the top. If you prefer, you can use your bail makers or round nose pliers just to make that slightly easier. What I wanted to show you today is how quickly you can make this, and with few tools as well. I'm just going to open up the wire that we are working with now so that it flares away in opposite directions. It's not crossing over. I'm going to find the 6 o'clock position on my frame, and I'm going to lay the section of hooped wire over the top. Now, just by comparison, you don't need a huge amount for a much smaller cab. It does need to come up and over the surface of the cabochon, not just sit on the sides, or your cab will flop out, and that's not what we want at all. Because this is a large cabochon, I'm going to lay quite a large portion of that looped section over the surface. When I'm happy that that's sitting in position, and we take a quick look, we know that that will be quite secure. There's plenty of wire there to sit over the surface. What I need to do now is press down with that looped section over the surface of the framework, pinch that really firmly into position, and wind the tail on the right all the way around. You can bring the elongated section up the centre, all the way around, and what we've done is we've looped around that frame wire. I'm going to continue on so that that sits at the back of the cabochon frame now. And what I will need to do is just draw that carefully into position. So what we have is a loop sitting over the front. We've secured it on one side. One tail is just coming away for now. So what I'm going to do is use my thumb to create a nice, generous proportion of wire which sits over the back of the cabochon. And what I'm going to do is set this at the cardinal points. So if you're looking at a compass, you've got north, south, east and west. I'm thinking of it as a clock face. So we're going to go from the 6 o'clock position over to the 3 o'clock position. And again, you can use much smaller loops for smaller cabochons. Pop that back in the corner. So I'm going to turn this slightly around, and I'm going to support underneath where the line of wire intersects the frame wire, and I'm going to wrap around the frame wire with the lighter gauge wire all the way 1.5 times. So drawing that around the framework and then up and over the surface. What I'm going to do here is just give that a quick squeeze to make sure that that sits neatly into position. Now, there's nothing difficult about this next section. What I want to do is warm the wire through and recreate the little hooped section that we made right down at the 6 o'clock when we first began wrapping. If that gets a little bit away from you, you can just tighten that up slightly. Now again, you could use round nose pliers, you could use your bail making pliers if you prefer, but I'm just going to go by eye and give that a bit of a manoeuvre until it sits approximately where I want it to sit. So I'm popping that at the 3 o'clock position so that we will have 4 areas going across the front of your cabochon. Give that a bit of a squeeze. And then what we're going to do is wrap around the frame wire with this tail again. So pinch very, very firmly. Once you've got that shape set, you can push the wire up inside the main frame if you like, and then draw this across the back. So I'm just going to make sure that that sits where I want it to sit. If it goes a little bit to one side, as it has done here, you can very simply change the shape of that hoop a little bit, just to get that nice and symmetrical. And what I'm going to do now, just off camera, is exactly the same but on the other side. So I will meet you back in just a moment. So all I've done on the left hand side is exactly the same as where we started on the right hand side. I'm just wrapping cautiously 1.5 times around that frame wire with the lighter wire, and I'll show you now how we can move that forwards and start setting our cabochon into position. So you can see at the moment the cab frame is slightly out of skew, but that's fine because we've got a little bit of work to go just yet. It's not a tricky procedure at all. Now my side wires, which are the lighter wire, that 0.8 or 20 gauge, just a little bit under stress. I've just smoothed those through and warmed them up slightly. I also left in position the fact that one of my side loops is slightly wonky because I want to show you how to just fix that if you need to. We're going to start tightening up those coils that form around the side of the frame wire, and then we're just going to pull into position very, very carefully, little by little. What we're going to do is reform where the centre of that hooped section that falls over the face of the cab sits. You might need to just apply a little bit of pressure to get things to sit where you want. Those shapes are quite flat at the moment, and cabochons by their nature are domed on the surface. So the next thing that we're going to need to do is to elevate those slightly. Now I'm only going to be using 3 tools today, which are my bent chain nose pliers, my flush cutters, and my round nose pliers. These are all good basic tools that you can achieve quite easily and should form part of any beginner's toolkit who wants to get into wire working. So what I'm going to do, these hooped sections that will go over the face of the cabochon, I need to elevate them, but I need to elevate them without undoing the wrapping that we've created around that frame wire. So I'm going to very, very gently lift them, and I'm going to support those sections that go underneath the cab at the same time. So you can see I've just lifted that a little bit. To do that by hand, it's a little bit easier, but what you need to do is make sure you're supporting those coils so that they don't come undone. If they do slightly open up, just get in there and tighten that up gently. So we're going to hold the rear wires down, these swooping sections over the back, and elevate a little looped section that comes over the front. Now they're not exactly flat in the finished position, so what we're going to do is put a little bit of a curve over the top of that cab. So all I'm doing is I'm gripping hold of the end and very gently putting a little bit of a smooth manoeuvre. So I'll do the same on this one, but with it elevated to camera. So it's just a very, very gentle manoeuvre with the pliers to make that tip roll over just a little bit. Try and get this one at the same angle. So you can see at the moment it's reasonably flat. We just want the end of that to go over just a little bit. I'm going to lift that first and then take that end piece over. So we're going to try sliding the cab in. Now I'll be taking this apart because this is now my official stunt cab to do tutorials with. But what you would need to do is make sure there are no smutty fingerprints on your cab before you slide it carefully into position. So you can see that I've actually left far too large a gap at the top there. But what you can do is just draw that nice and tightly into position. So you have choices about how you can finish this off. You've got enough wire. If I flip that over to the back, you could do a prong either side of the neck section. But what I want to do is choose whichever of my wires is slightly longer. So I've got a little bit more to work with on this side. So if I flip the design over onto the back, what I'm going to do is take the shorter one out of the way for just a second. I'm very, very carefully just warming that wire through and getting it out of the way. What I'm going to do is wrap once on one side of those two upright necks, bring it over the front in the little looped design exactly where we started from at the 6 o'clock position, and then tie it off on the other side. This will mean that we have sealed those two uprights together and closed the cabochon into position. So I'll flip the design back over. This is the slightly longer wire, so we're going to start off very close to the left hand side. Now this is trickier to show with the cab in position, so I'm just going to slip that out for a second. During the first part of this section of the tutorial, you absolutely can still slide that cab out. So I'm going to make sure that I'm happy that everything is true and square, and that's properly up at the 12 o'clock. That looks pretty good to me. And I'm going to pull the slightly longer of the two wires so that it transects the frame wire underneath, and then I'm going to wrap that all the way around so that's nice and warm. One over the top again, and then draw that back down over the surface. Now before we pop the cab into position, I'm just going to elevate that wire slightly. I'm very, very firmly gripping onto my frame so that I don't pull it all out of shape whilst I'm just warming this finer gauge wire. Going to give that a bit of a squeeze just to tighten up those coils on the framework, and I'm going to create the form. Now I'm just going to use my finger to do that to show that you don't have to have any fancy tools, but you could use your bail maker if you have one. So those little loops that are holding our cabochon into position are all around about the same size. You can take much more time if you want to make sure that they are all as identical as you want them to be. So I'm going to elevate that. It's not really a prong, but I'm going to call it a loopy prong for the moment. And I'm just going to bring that up and away, like so. So it sits forwards of the design, so that we can get that cabochon back in nice and neatly. So if you put the cab in as it was before, it's gone straight through the bottom, all good. Inside the rear wires, and then just flip that up and over the top. What we need to do now is finish off by wrapping around the right hand shoulder. And that will tie those two uprights together nice and neatly. What tends to happen when you're wrapping one wire around another is as you pull the wire over the top, it gets shorter. And what we'll end up with is one side of your loopy prong being shorter than the other. So I'm actually working with a really nice strong material today. It's an onyx druzy. So what I'm going to do is pinch the wire. It's round wire, so it doesn't really have very many scratchy bits on it. I'm going to pinch that very, very firmly while I just warm the tail of the wire through. And again, we're ignoring the other wire for now. I'm going to give that a bit of a warm through. And what I want to do is loop that just around the outside framework. So pinching that against the stone should stop the wire from getting too short on the right hand side. So there's a little bit of a gap further away, so I'm going to post the tail up inside that gap and allow that to slide all the way along to where the neck section is. And you can see that we've centralised that loopy prong part. So again, just making sure that your cab is sitting square in the design and you're happy with the direction of all of your loopy prong parts. Going to push that up nice and tight against the upright on the right hand side. I'm going to push that all the way around across the back. So you can take a little bit more time to make that perfect. And I'm just going to flip the design over, pushing those prongs onto position before I flip it over. So we need to make sure that this is nice and tight and safe at the back. So what I'm going to do is use the side that we didn't attach. This was the shorter side. And I'm going to draw that across the back in a similar, almost like a swag or a swoop, like so. And I'm just going to draw these two uprights together. Does benefit if you just get them nice and straight, like so. I'm going to take that tail all the way around, and all I'm doing here is wrapping the slightly lighter wire around the heavier frame wire. What I need to do is make sure that I'm wrapping them side by side. I don't want them to twist so that one goes on top of the other. One of the things you can do to help this occur is just do one wrap, give it a very gentle squeeze. Take that second wrap over. What I'm going to do is flip it onto the front. This is my primary direction that I'm going to be viewing this pendant in. Therefore, this is the side I care just slightly more about being super neat. So again, just checking that everything is square. We can tighten those up a little bit with the pliers like so. And I'm just going to use the remainder of this wire. Every time I do a wrap, I'm just going to give that a very gentle squeeze just to lock it into position. You can see that those two wires are trying to twist now, and that's because I'm wrapping around them with that slightly lighter wire. Give that a very gentle squeeze just for a second. Things are getting a little bit loose at the back, so I'm going to flip that over and tidy that up. Flip it back to the front, and then take that last one over the top. So I've got 5 wraps going around that neck section. That looks pretty decent to me. That will work, and once I've completed setting the entire cabochon, I can open these out a little bit if I want to and just get the shape absolutely perfect. What I want to do is show you what to do with this other wire. I'm just going to draw that across the back, so tie those nice and neatly together. You've got a couple of choices here. What I'm going to do is put an extra little loop down the back just for security's sake. If you wanted to wear it in this direction, you might want to omit this part of the design and just trim away here. In fact, let's just trim away to show you how you can finish that so it's perfectly symmetrical. So I'm going to take those flush cutters, trim that away into the scrap pot for later use. And what we're going to do is tuck that end section so that it sits between the cab and the frame. We don't want that to get hurting the skin or catching on hair or clothes or anything like that. So that's tucked neatly away. This tail we're just going to hold off using for a second because we'll probably put a coil on that later. Now I want to show you an invention of mine, which is the loopy bail. If you don't want to spend eons wire weaving spectacular designs up on the neck of a bail, if your wire is heavy enough, and probably for a cabochon of this size I would take that up to 16 gauge 1.25mm, but in the essence of using a lighter gauge such as the 1mm 18 gauge, it does work as well for smaller cabs. So the first thing I'm going to do is trim these two ends so that they're the same length. I'm just going to straighten that last little bit out because I've decided we're going to use it. So we need those to be exactly the same length and with the flush side of the cut. Then we're going to pop back in with the round nose pliers and put a small loop on the top. A small coil rather. So the coils go outwards. I'm just going to get that started so it's 1.5 coils. Same on the other side. Like so. Just roll that around until you get 2 which are the same. Now you can use any round form for this next section. You could use a pencil if you wanted to. So do I have a pencil to hand? I have a pen which has a lovely tutorial on the top. So what we're going to do is make sure that we're happy with the strength of that neck section. That's one of the pieces of a pendant which tends to take a little bit of the action. So we need to make sure that that's nice and strong. So I'm just going to make sure that that's all good and safe, and we'll pop a coil on that in a moment. Making sure that these are both nice and straight. What we're going to do is pull those 2 straight lines forward slightly. It's about 30-degree angle from the baseline of the back of the pendant, and what we're going to do is roll around our round form. You could use your bail makers if you have them. If you don't have bail makers, not a problem. And what we're going to do is gently splay those 2 sections with the coils on and just draw them all the way around the outside. Now the reason I haven't completed those coils is I don't know just yet how much I want sticking up at the top. So I'm going to run that around, bring those around one more time, I think, because there's quite a lot to work with, and just wrap those around your pencil design or your bail makers if you have them. So if I withdraw that round shape now and just tighten up, you can see that we've got the low-key bail into position, and it works exactly the same way. This is both raw wire. raw copper wire rather. So what I'm going to do now is pop a coil on the end of the lighter gauge wire. And to make my life easier, I form the coil coming up and away from the pendant to begin with. So we've started that spiralling form. Just going to close that up and roll that around. Now, to make your coils perfect, take your time, small movements. Lots of small movements is much better and you'll end up with much neater, nicer coils. The act of opening and closing the pliers on that coil as you go strengthens it. So get that nice and tight to the centre of your bail and then just push that down over the surface. So it is a very fast to build, very accessible tutorial. And if you find that your bail is slightly open, what you can do is flip that over, support it underneath and just tighten that up. Now if you have a mandrel, or a triblet rather, which is the same dimension all the way along, it's much easier because you can just give that a gentle hammer, flip that back over, withdraw the round form again, and there you have it. It does not take long at all. Now in terms of getting these shapes perfect, using a set of round pliers will certainly help you get that shape a little bit more perfect than I did during the making of the tutorial. Pop that back down over the surface. And again, the benefit of putting that slight curvature on the end is that it will sit down against the cabochon. Now, when I first started working with cabs about 7 years ago, I developed something called the shake test. This is the shake test. If your cabochon doesn't come out when it's over something nice and safe, like over your beading mat, for instance, then you can probably pretty much wear that straight away. Certain designs will be much more secure than others. So if I was going to actually use this to keep, make this to keep, I would definitely have sized up the wires, used heavier gauges of wire, and probably more points coming over the surface of the cab. In terms of demonstrating the actual technique to you, having a large cab to help you see what wire is going where is of benefit. Certainly with a smaller cabochon like this, working with 1mm 18 gauge and 0.8mm 20 gauge is adequate. And it's a really nice, simple design to work with. I hope you have enjoyed the tutorial today. Super easy, super simple, super achievable. You only really need 3 tools, 2 gauges of wire, and there's no fancy weaving that takes forever. Perfect really for when you just want to throw a piece of jewellery on to go out straight away, or you've got a new cab and you just can't wait to see what it looks like. It's a really easy and achievable form to work with. I'm Gem Hawks. It's been my pleasure to be with you today. I will be live over on Facebook at 8 PM British time tomorrow. It's every other Monday. I hope that you'll be able to join me there for some chat and some gemstones and some carvings and all sorts of shenanigans we have. You take care and I'll see you very soon. Bye for now.